South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has once again placed himself at the center of Africa's economic conversation, sending a message to global powers: Africa is not a continent in search of aid but a continent in search of equal partnerships. His latest call, directed toward Japan, urges one of Asia's leading economic giants to play a proactive role in supporting tariff cooperation and fairer trade practices with African nations. At a time of global inequality and protectionist debates, Ramaphosa's words are a rallying cry for Africa's economic sovereignty. Speaking to Japanese officials and business leaders, Ramaphosa emphasized that the old relationship, one where Africa is cast as a recipient of aid and handouts, no longer defines the continent's trajectory. Instead, Africa is rising as a hub of innovation, industrial potential, and young human capital, seeking equal footing with partners. His call for tariff cooperation is rooted in the argument that while Africa has much to offer the world, the barriers placed on African goods and services by foreign markets keep the continent at the margins of global trade. The persistence of tariffs, restrictive rules of origin, and other barriers often means African nations cannot fully compete, even when their industries are producing goods that meet international standards. Ramaphosa's appeal to Japan is therefore not just symbolic but deeply practical. It seeks to reframe Africa's relationship with one of the world's most advanced economies from donor-recipient to genuine trading partners. For decades, international development discourse has been dominated by aid packages, conditional loans, and assistance programs from wealthier countries to Africa. While these have provided temporary relief in times of crisis, they have entrenched dependency and created a cycle portraying Africa as incapable of standing alone. Ramaphosa's intervention challenges this paradigm head-on. By calling for tariff cooperation, he is demanding structural change in the way global markets treat African goods. He argues that if Africa is granted fair access to markets, its industries can thrive, jobs can be created, and the cycle of dependency can be broken, not through handouts but through economic empowerment. The choice of Japan as an addressee is no accident. Japan has historically maintained cordial relations with African nations and has invested in various development programs. But what Ramaphosa wants now is a step beyond aid. He wants Japan to be a partner in building trade relationships that benefit both sides, where African products are welcomed in Japanese markets without excessive tariffs, and where Japanese companies see Africa not as a charity case but as a business frontier. In his view, Africa is the future, a continent of 1.4 billion people, rich in natural resources, bursting with young entrepreneurs, and on the cusp of technological revolutions that could reshape global commerce. Ramaphosa's comments also reflect a growing trend across the continent where leaders are rejecting paternalistic approaches from both West and East. Instead, they are seeking relationships that respect Africa's sovereignty. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, one of the largest trade pacts in the world, is central to this vision. It aims to remove barriers within Africa itself, enabling smoother trade between African countries, but for the pact to reach its full power, external cooperation is vital. Tariff relief from major partners like Japan would not only bolster African exports but also solidify Africa's place as a serious player in the global economy. Critics, however, argue that while Ramaphosa's rhetoric is inspiring, the realities of global economics are far more complex. Japan, like many advanced economies, faces its own domestic pressures to protect local industries from external competition. Tariff reduction is really just about fairness, it balances political and economic interests at home. The question is whether Japan will heed Ramaphosa's call and take the risk of opening its markets more fully to African goods. Still, by making this demand, Ramaphosa has ensured that the conversation shifts. Instead of waiting quietly for crumbs from the global table, Africa is demanding a seat where decisions are made and trade rules are written. The symbolism of asking for partnership rather than aid is powerful. It changes the narrative. It forces the world to recognize Africa as a continent of agency rather than a continent of need. For young Africans listening to Ramaphosa's words, this message is empowering. It signals their leaders see them not as passive recipients but as participants shaping global trade. For Japanese investors and policymakers, it is a reminder that the continent they may once have overlooked is fast becoming one of the most dynamic regions in the world economy. This moment also highlights Ramaphosa's attempt to reassert leadership, both domestically and internationally. At home, he faces criticism for South Africa's sluggish economy, persistent inequality, and internal political turmoil. Yet on the global stage, he projects himself as a statesman for Africa's future. By championing the cause of tariff cooperation, he not only places South Africa at the center of the debate but also positions himself as a spokesperson for the broader African continent. This duality, domestic struggle and international ambition, defines much of his presidency. The implications of such a shift could be enormous. If Japan and other major economies heed Africa's call, industries across the continent could experience a boom. Agricultural exports could find new markets, manufacturers could compete globally, and technology partnerships with Japan could grow. The effects, job creation, poverty reduction, infrastructure growth, could transform Africa's economy within a generation. But for this vision to be realized, it requires more than promises. It requires binding agreements and sustained political will from all parties. The EFF and other opposition voices argue Ramaphosa's international declarations must be matched by domestic action. They say that calling for tariff cooperation abroad means little if the government cannot fix internal inefficiencies, corruption, and barriers to growth within South Africa itself. Yet even critics cannot deny that Ramaphosa's framing of Africa's relationship with the world is a refreshing departure from the old narratives of dependency. By urging partners like Japan to treat Africa with fairness, he voices a new generation of leaders rejecting cycles of underdevelopment. This is not just about trade, it is about dignity. It is about shifting the way Africa is perceived globally, from a continent in crisis to a continent of opportunity. By calling on Japan to support tariff cooperation, Ramaphosa is demanding respect. He is articulating the kind of vision that, if realized, could change the balance of power in international trade. Whether Japan and others will respond positively remains to be seen, but what is clear is that Africa's voice is growing louder, firmer, and more insistent. Africa is standing up, and Ramaphosa is challenging the status quo. These are the stories that shape our world, the calls for fairness, the struggles for sovereignty, the demands for equality on the global stage. The question is whether the world is ready to listen. Don't miss out, hit subscribe, join our community, and stay with us as we bring you clarity and honesty.